don't know me, my name is Anat. I'm the coach of the VGU University Debate Society, which is your host in this amazing tournament. We're very, very glad to have you over here. And this workshop, we're going to talk a little bit about engagement. So the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, why is engagement so important? Surprisingly, there are no English native speakers here, which is a pity because I suspect many of them could use a little bit of work on engagement based on what I've seen in the last EUDC. But for those of you who are here, why is engagement important? It's not a rhetoric question. Go. Speak. I'm not going to speak for an hour and a half. Come on, you need to speak as well. Why is it so important to engage in a debate?
If you don't engage with the other team's material, it's basically up to the judge to decide which gives the more important material.
More specifically, and this is crucial to understand, because this is a conceptual shift in the way we debate. Debating is a relative game. You don't need to be right. You don't have to prove that what you say is true. Most of the times, it isn't. All you need to do in order to win a debate is prove your points better than any of the other three teams in the room. What this means is that one way of proving your points better is just having tons and tons of analysis and facts and examples and all those things. But another way of proving your points better than the other teams is just by showing the deficiencies in their case, showing why their points don't stand, showing why the scenario that they're trying to portray isn't going to materialize, that sort of stuff. This is what we do through engagement. We basically show why our case is more likely, more persuasive, more true to an extent, sometimes has more impact than other teams' arguments. The thing is, in order to do this, and this is the first thing that most debaters don't do, you need to listen. A lot of times when we come to a debate, all we think about is, what are we going to say? What do we have standing on our side? Why are we right? And we don't spend enough time thinking about the other side. This is especially true and especially crucial because a lot of times we have that gut instinct in response to something that someone says. Let's sort of hear what they say and say, oh, but that's wrong because blah, 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 blah. And we don't listen to their full explanation. And what we need to remember is that when we're talking about engagement, what's important is to think, what is the judge going to buy of what they said? And why is that bit not true? Not what they said that is very ridiculous and neither me nor the judge are going to be persuaded by. So one of the crucial things we need to do is remember that we want to listen to the other side. And we want to listen with the thought of, what is the strongest version of this argument that can come up, and how do I engage with that? How can I take this argument at its strongest version and show why that is not the case? And then if I beat this version, obviously I've also beaten each and every one of the smaller, more pathetic, weaker versions of the argument that they brought to the table. So, yeah.
Maybe directly on that. So if there's really a stupid argument that you don't find persuasive and you know that the judge probably won't find persuasive at all, is it okay then not to engage with that point at all, or would you still have to dedicate a little bit of time to...
I will respond to that, but in a few minutes. So the first thing that I want to do before I respond to that and to many other of the issues is talk to you a little bit about what we're going to cover in this workshop and in what way, and then we can approach each and every one of the specific questions. So in which parts, or how do we engage, what parts of our speech can count as engagement? What do we want to do? Basically, engagement comes to play in three different ways. First of all is the direct engagement, or rebuttal, as we often call it. And that's when I take the other side's argument and I say why they're not true. Second of all is the indirect engagement, which is my arguments. A lot of time, in fact, in most of the times in debates, what usually happens is that we enact policy X. My side of the debate argued that if we enact policy X, Y is going to happen. Other side of the debate says if we enact policy X, Z is going to happen. And then the debate becomes a question of which is going to happen, Y or Z, and which is better, and all of those things. So for example, say take a very Israeli motion. Luckily, I don't know any of the motions in this tournament, so I'm free to use whatever examples I want. So, for example, there was a big debate in Israel about separating men and women in buses for ultra-Orthodox, right? One can say if we allow for the separation, that means that we're strengthening the radicals and they're going to become even more radical, and then they're going to discriminate even more against women, that sort of stuff. Another one is the other side is going to say, obviously, well, if we come towards them, if we help them, then they're going to also show a goodwill, and eventually both communities will come together, and everyone will love each other, and there will be peace and love and sunshine and butterflies, right? There are two scenarios, and they're competing, and there's a question which one is going to materialize. That's indirect engagement. That's when I'm not saying this isn't going to happen, but when I'm saying, look, they said X happened, we say Y is happening, here's why Y is so much more likely. That's the other bit of engagement that we have. Then thirdly, we have the idea of POIs. POIs are the most direct forms of engagement, because obviously when I'm asking a POI, the other person is right in the middle of their speech, they're able to respond immediately to whatever it is that I'm asking. So hopefully, if time allows, I'm going to cover, first of all, rebuttal, then arguments, and then thirdly, I'm going to talk about POIs. One thing I want to explain before we well into these three parts is that for me, engagement starts already from the 15 minutes of prep. It's not just something you think about during the debate. It's something you need to think about in advance. That plays into a number of things. I don't know how many of you were here for Helena's workshop, but Helena started her workshop by saying, already in the first couple of minutes of the prep, one of the things that I'm thinking about is my philosophy. In Israel, we often call it my grandstanding principle. What it is that I'm arguing in the name of, what it is that I believe in. A lot of time, a lot of my engagement comes from that philosophy. If I approach a certain debate from, say, a socialist point of view, then all of my perspective is socialist. Then I don't believe, for example, that capital trickles down. I believe we need to start from the bottom. That directs the way I answer certain arguments. That directs the way I respond to certain things. So thinking about my philosophy and my GSP helps me in engagement because it gives me sort of the how I think the world operates, what I think is important in the world, and why. And that's the first thing that I do. That also helps me because then if someone asks me a POI that isn't directly connected to my case, and I'm not sure what the hell are they going to do with it, where are they going to take it, again, sorry for the non-Israelis in the room, but the Israelis know those as males POI of, so, if I show you that pigs can fly, do I win this debate? And then you have to think, how is he going to show that pigs are going to fly? Can I disprove that? Is this connected to my case? Yeah, fine, whatever. And you sort of give up quite a lot of your case. So the idea is, if I have a big philosophy, I'm usually able to also think, when someone asks me a POI, how does that play with my philosophy? How does that play with what I believe in? The other thing that I think is incredibly useful in terms of engagement is what I often like to call the borders of my case. People who I coach, I often tell, like, I'm a summary speaker myself. I love summaries. I think they're the best part of the debate. And what I often say is, during the prep time when my partner needs to think about the bizarre thing called an extension and develop that and make that, what I do is I enjoy thinking about engagement. And one of the things is I always like to think about the points at the end of the case or at the beginning, so what defines the case. So for example, I think we all know the chemical castration for repeated sex offenders debate. Everyone knows the motion? So what's coming up by the naming? Chemical castration for repeated sex offenders. Now within that debate, as you all know, there is often the clash of effectiveness, right? Opposition are going to argue chemical castration doesn't work, rape is not a crime of sex, it's a crime of violence, so even if you reduce sexual urges, they're still going to have violent urges. What I like to do as a POI in terms of the limits of the case is get up on a point of information and ask the proposition side. If you believe chemical castration works so well, will you allow a convicted pedophile to work in a kindergarten? Now notice, if they say yes, then the minute I prove it's not effective, all the impact that I had in the debate have grown this big because they've just allowed pedophiles to work in kindergartens. If they say no, then clearly they indicate they don't believe in their own case because they've just backed from their principle and said, well, we don't trust that person fully, we think he should still be limited. So this is a question that concerns the edges of the case, the borders of the case, but makes the principles, therefore, so much clearer. So a lot of times during the prep times, I try to think, where are the borders of this case? Where did this lie? And can I ask questions about these borders that will clarify the debate? Okay, so first thing that I want to talk about is rebuttal. And here I'm also going to talk a little bit about what Florian asked before. So what do we rebut? Clearly, we can't rebut everything they said because they spoke for 7 minutes. And if I try to rebut everything they said, then unless I speak much faster than them, which is sometimes the case for me, but not for most people, I just can't answer everything, right? So generally speaking, what you want to answer are the strongest and the most central points of the case. It is very tempting and very easy to what we often call kick a dead horse. It is very easy to knock down an argument that is already very weak and then dance around a little bit and be very, very joyous by the stupidity of the other side. What is usually going to happen after you've done that is that the back half is going to win the debate because you've just defeated first prop and lost everything else because you spent a lot of time on a silly point and never actually got to the real, meat and whatever of the debate. So it's important to focus on the important points, on the central points, and on the strongest points, the ones that are also going to give you credit when the judges evaluate your speech. Now here's an important thing. The important and strongest points of the other side don't necessarily have to be in their arguments. A lot of times, a lot of speakers neglect rebutting the rebuttal. Notice, if I'm a second speaker, as personally I am, if I don't rebut the rebuttal, that means that my partner's speech is now weak, because it has been attacked and I have not tackled down the attacks. So it's crucial to rebut the rebuttal, and it's crucial to show why my partner's points still stand. Also, a lot of times, some of the best and cleverest bits of analysis of people, also many times, some of the most clever, most creative points of the other side will come up in the rebuttal, and if I don't bother engaging with them, I'm going to miss out on a significant part of their case. You've all seen Monica, I suspect, at least in some of her speeches / in the previous workshop. Monica is, for example, a speaker that has tons of analysis in her rebuttal. If you don't rebut her rebuttal, you're going to miss out on a huge chunk of the debate. So it's important to remember to rebut not just arguments, but also the rebuttal of the other side. This is especially true, obviously, in the case of summations, where our partner brought the extension. These are going to be the only new arguments we bring to the table, so if we don't reestablish them on the case, we've gone. Second thing that is important is, I major in philosophy. In philosophy, we have what we call the charitable reading principle. Always give a charitable reading to the other side's argument. Even if something sounds incredibly silly, try and stop for a second and ask, why is the judge likely to be persuaded by this? Why is this actually a clever point that I'm just missing out? Because if you don't give it a charitable reading, and the judge did give it a charitable reading, you're going to miss out on points of engagement, and the other side is simply going to beat you purely because you didn't bother answering something. So always try and think whether that point can actually be illustrated in a persuasive manner. Next, it is important to remember that you want to answer not just the bottom line of an argument, which is what people often do, but also the way that led us there. Because a lot of times the steps on the way make the point more powerful than just answering the bottom line. I'm going to talk a little bit in a few seconds about types of rebuttal. Before I do that, there are 3 more points I'd like to emphasize. One thing which people forget to do, and this is crucial, is to explain what we call the normative value or the impact of the rebuttal. It's not enough to say, they said this and this is wrong. It then has to be followed with the And this is why their case can't stand. You have to explain about why what you've just said about their argument, what you've just answered, demolishes their case. If you just say something that even if it doesn't necessarily mean he thinks that you've now ruined their case. So that's one thing that is crucial to remember. The other thing that is crucial to remember within that context is that a lot of times what people do is they get up, they ask a point of information about an argument, the other side answers them, and then they get up and they make the exact same point in their speech. That point has already been answered. Once you hear a response to your POI, you need to then integrate that response into your speech. You now have to engage with the new, latest, possibly stronger version of the argument, and not with the previous version of the argument. A lot of times people just stick to what they heard first, and they don't necessarily engage with the stronger, more nuanced version of the argument. Last bit that I'm going to talk about before I talk again about the idea of how do we respond to arguments is the rebuttal is going to be interwoven in my speech, and I'm going to integrate my answers to them and flag them. Of course, you always promise, you failed debaters, but never actually fulfill. Bear in mind two things. Number one, most of you don't deliver on your promises, right? You promise the rebuttal will be integrated, it's not. You promise you will flag it, you don't. Number two, and more importantly, okay, and this is crucial, usually we need to distinguish between what we call competing analysis and contradicting analysis. Contradicting analysis is they said this is false because. Competing analysis is saying they said this, but this is also true and more important. Usually, what you have in your arguments is competing analysis. You normally don't say why they're wrong in your speech. You usually in your argument say why you're right. That means that if you promise to me that you'll have your rebuttal interwoven in your points, usually you only do the competing bit, and you don't always do the contradicting bit. Now that is better than nothing, but that is just usually not enough. Because that then leaves it up to the judge to say, well, they said this, it's up to me to make the decision which of the two I find more. And what you need to do is say, they said this is false because, we say this is true because. And I usually feel that when people say, I will leave it to my arguments, they just don't do it. So bear in mind, actually bother to rebut. Now, let's talk a little bit about how to engage with arguments. So, you know what, because OE wanted this to be an interactive workshop, and because it'll be very, very boring for me to go into detail, I'm going to make an argument now. You all just need to attack me, demolish it. Like, I really have nothing prepared here, so it'll be very easy to demolish it. And according to your answers, we can then typecast all the different forms of rebuttal, or at least some of the different forms of rebuttal. So give me a motion, something fun, something exciting, not the EU. Come on.
No, Hannibal.
Seriously? You do realize that you're playing right up to my element. So now Hannibal is a mode of operation theoretically existing in the IDF, whereby if an Israeli soldier is kidnapped, it is the role of his comrades or his unit members to shoot the hostage, because a dead soldier is better than a kidnapped soldier. Yeah. And it's the topic of many heated debates in Israel. There is also an interpretation of this procedure according to which you also shoot everything around it, which is then disproportionate and therefore doesn't meet the Geneva Convention requirements, but that's the less interesting version. So basically, for all of you who have, I know I'm very old, but I suspect at least some of you have seen the movie Speed. There is that bit in the elevator where it says, well, what do you do if someone falls hostage? And again, you shoot the hostage, you shoot the hostage, you shoot the hostage. That's the debate we're having. Do you want me to be for it or against it?
Against.
Against? No, Hannibal? Fine. Okay, so remember, you need to rebut this, right? So I'm going to make one simple argument for why we think the Hannibal procedure is ineffective in action. What I'm going to say is that generally, when we talk about military strategy, we always have to think long term. We cannot think just about this specific operation, but we have to think generally and to the long term about how this will impact the way our army works. When we enact procedures such as the Hannibal procedures, what we are doing is we're actually undermining the motivation and the willingness of soldiers to take on dangerous missions. Because what we basically tell them is, look, you know what? We love you, you're one of our sons, we appreciate everything you do for the army, but once you get in a risky situation, you're on your own. We're no longer supporting you, we're no longer there at your service, we are actually going to do whatever it takes in order to kill you. What we think is that while this may be, according to what the proposition side is going to say, beneficial in the short term, because we won't have a hostage soldier, we won't need to negotiate with terrorists, we won't need to release many more terrorists, and all the things that the proposition are going to say, what this does is it undermines the motivation and the ability of our soldiers to operate. It does so on 3 different levels. First of all, because we believe that soldiers will be less willing to volunteer to risky operations if they know that once something goes bad, they are going to die. So we think that that one thing is very, very dangerous and very crucial in and of itself. But we think there's a second level of analysis that is even more problematic. We think that a lot of time in the army, we trust camaraderie to serve as a motivational tool. We trust the idea that people trust one another and lean on one another and get support from one another. We think that when you tell people, look, it's okay, he's your brother, you spend 24/7 with him, you sleep with him on the same bed, you fight with him, you do everything with him, but comes the moment you will also need to shoot them, we think that that means that people will be less inclined to actually have that 100% faith in their comrades. We think that people will be less inclined to make that camaraderie to begin with, because they will be afraid that at the due day, they will not be able to shoot them. So they will, in advance, not develop this affiliation and this camaraderie that is so detrimental and so crucial for units to be able to fight efficiently. And we think that once people do that, then the unit as a whole functions less well. Last but not least, we think that part of it, especially in countries such as Israel, where the army is conscription army and mandatory service, at least part of the power of the army comes from the idea that these are our sons, everyone take part in it, we are all united together. When we tell people, look, we're going to require you to shoot your friends, right? So it's not just about my fear of dying, it's about my fear of having to shoot a friend. People are going to view the army differently. People are going to have less faith in the army, and that again will undermine the army's ability to work. And it is because of these impacts, the long-term efficiency of such a procedure, such as the Hannibal procedure, is often very, very problematic. Now, that was terrible, so please, 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 kill me. Kill me now. No, yeah, kill me.
I would extend the idea of camaraderie to the Israeli society and the army, and show that basically you can analyze it in the way that the description itself is also kind of viewed as a harm. And if we're able to understand this as a society, that some harm sometimes has to be done for the security, especially
So this is a very specific type of rebuttal. We call it if we follow your logic. If what you're saying is true in this case, it would also be true for conscription as a whole. And we already see that it is not true about conscription as a whole, which is why it is also not true in your case. This is one type of rebuttal which we often use is saying, okay, I'm going to now, we're not going to abstract your idea and think about it in a more general way, not about this specific case. This is the underlying principle of your case. This is what happens when we apply it in other cases. This is why it's false. Amazing. Next. Yeah, remind me your name.
Yoni.
Yoni.
I think there's an unexplained basis for this argument, which assumes that for everyone, and in truth, being a hostage is better than death in every case.
Okay, so that's a problematic rebuttal. I'm going to say this. So, two parts of my explanation. One bit is the first bit, and that's saying, look, another way of rebuttal is saying they didn't explain, right? In which case, what we do is we point to flaws in the other side's explanation. That is useful, that is not great in debate if that's the only thing you do, because obviously then the next speaker cannot come up and explain, and we've done nothing. So what you usually need to do is you say they didn't explain, and also, and then have some other response. Why I didn't like your answer is because notice that if you accept the idea that being hostage is not worse than dying, then obviously also the other side can't win. That's a good response to why I'm wrong, but that doesn't explain why the prof side, remember, wants people to die rather than be hostages, is right. So that's a problem within the consistency of the prof's case. Remember that rebuttal always had to be consistent with your case. Next, Itai.
You had an assertion within your arguments that combat soldiers think about this idea of me being hostage and stuff like that. We never got an explanation why they think most of them want to be heroes and therefore do not think about the idea, and most of them have the tendency to think that that will not happen to me, therefore this is not that bad, or something like that.
Okay, so notice Itai combined what Yoni did with the extra step. So he first of all said, you didn't explain why soldiers think this way, blah, 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 blah. He then went on to say, and this is important, this isn't true, right? What you said, that soldiers think about it this way, is wrong. A, I'm not sure they really think about it. B, if they do think about it, possibly what they think is, yay, I'm going to be a hero. Everyone's going to know my name. Fame! Yes. I'm going to live forever, guys. This workshop is being videotaped so that I get fame. Next. Yeah.
About the motivation of soldiers not to fight anymore if they know that their comrades might shoot them if they get captured. So you could say, well, soldiers, of course, they don't want to be shot, but they are able to think further about what this principle would mean, and that the incentive of the opponent to take them hostage would greatly diminish if they know that this is going to be valueless because the soldier is going to be shot. So they will put this principle much higher than the idea of that they don't want to die. You realize that this, in the long term, is going to benefit.
Right. So this is again another type of explanation for why this isn't true. Basically, this is saying, look, you think this is how it's going to impact soldiers. We think your explanation is false. We think soldiers are actually going to respond this way. And then making the analysis there. Go.
I would say perhaps that the comparison of short-term, long-term is the wrong one, because when we free terrorists and when we have captured soldiers, that also impacts the motivation of soldiers in the long term, in the sense that they go to capture terrorists and then they feel that it's meaningless, the fact that they know they might be captured themselves and so on.
So notice that what Ayan is doing is saying, you know what, fine. Even if what you said is true, I still don't think you win the debate, because let's compare it with the odds on the other side. Basically, this is what we often say, attack the argument's validity. So saying, even if all the premises are correct, this doesn't mean that the conclusion you derive from it is actually the right conclusion. Yeah, Nate.
Yes, sir. So you said that what this does is it disincentivizes soldiers into going into risky situations. Well, situations where people might end up hostages are also the same type of situations where people are very likely to maybe be killed, and therefore it may be. I mean, like, it may be true that there is a disincentive there, but because it already includes the risk of dying.
Yeah. Very, very true.
Is very low.
Basically, what he's saying is, look, you're telling me if I become a hostage, I might die. In the vast majority of cases in battlefield, I might die. If we follow your logic, soldiers would never ever have fought, because they would always be too afraid. This is just not the case. This is just not true. Excellent. Shulman.
At the end, you said the public might lose faith in the army. I would ask, why is that bad? Maybe I want our people to be more criticizing of the army?
Yep. So what Shulman does is he basically saying, you know what, I accept what you said is true. I just don't think this is necessarily a good thing. Or perhaps if you're on the other side of the debate, I accept what you say is true. I just not necessarily believe that this is actually a bad thing. That's also a form of attacking the normative value of the argument or the conclusion, so to speak. Right? So I want to, like, okay, this should have been numbered, this should be like, right? But the basic idea is this. So we have the styles of refuting that talk about things that the other side didn't do. So they didn't explain, they didn't prove, they didn't show, they didn't connect the problem and the solution, all that sort of stuff. And these things are good, and it's important to point them out, right? It's important to call the other side on their flaws, because that gives you some credit, and it mostly reduces some credit from the other side. But on top of doing that, if you don't want, for example, the back half team to then do that and outrank both you and the other team, you also want to say, either if we follow your logic then, or this isn't true, or this could be true, but it's actually a good or a bad thing, or saying this could be true, but there are things that are more important than that, right? Best scenario, you do a few of these, right? This is what we call a multi-layered rebuttal, whereby we don't just provide one answer to the other side's argument, but we actually provide a number of answers to the other side's argument. And this is good for a number of reasons. First of all, the obvious one, because even if the judge didn't buy one of our explanations, he might buy some of the others. But second of all, notice that once I make my rebuttal include a number of these stages, it almost becomes an argument in and of itself. Which means I'm going to get credit for analysis, not just in my arguments, but also in my rebuttal. I actually make the rebuttal to be a significant and contributing part of my speech. And I actually get credit for that. And a lot of judges would like that. This might also give me a lot of times creative ideas as to what to do in my speech, especially if I'm in the back half, for example, and the first half took pretty much most of what I intended to do in my extension, and then I'm with the, what shall I do? Okay, let's demolish the other side of the debate. At least that will be fun. Sometimes there are even some creative ideas there. Judges might give me credit for them. And I can tell you, for example, that in the last final of EUDC, a lot of what the winning teams got credit for was their rebuttal, not so much their new wonderful extension that they had there. It was a lot of the negative analysis and the focusing of the debate that we gave them credit for. So that's crucial, that's important. I want to say just like, I have a list here, but I don't have time to get into that because I really do want to cover also a little bit of engagement in arguments and POIs. I want to make 2 points that are part of this, but that people often neglect. First one that people often forget to think about is what we call false dichotomies, right? So a lot of times someone who's come in their speech are going to say, look, it's either A or B. Clearly A is terrible, which is why we're going to go for B. And a lot of times we immediately accept that framework, like for example, notice that in the speech I just gave, we've all accepted it's either hostage or dead. No third option whatsoever. There is no let's rescue them, right? There is no let's severely injure them so that the other side can't run with them and we might be able to. None of that existed. You all accepted my underlying assumption of this is either that they die or that they're hostage, right? A lot of times in debates, people assume dichotomies and don't prove them. And if you can get up and say, look, it's a false dichotomy. There is a third option that you didn't think of. There are other things you didn't come up with. There is another alternative that you didn't yet analyze. It gives you a lot of power in the debate because the other side usually didn't think of it. So they don't know how to deal with it. And a lot of time it will take them a lot of time to recuperate from it. This is also, by the way, very useful to point out in POI. The other thing that is important, is confusing probability with possibility. A lot of times in debates, people show why a certain thing might happen, right? We all see that in backlash argument, right? People say, well, if we do act X, then people might respond this and this way. What they don't show is why is this response or this reaction the most likely of all possible responses. So a lot of times it's very useful to come in rebuttal and just say, look, it's possible that this is what's going to happen, but it's not necessarily the most probable consequence of whatever, the most probable consequence of whatever it is that we're doing, right? So saying, look, they've proven possibility, what they haven't done is proven probability, is often a very useful tactic. And then if in your case, you show what your consequence is the most probable, you have a lot of power in the debate. Okay. So I've got 15 minutes more, which is awesome, because that leaves me 10 minutes for arguments and 5 minutes for POIs. So almost in time. So when I talk about engagement through my arguments, and notice, by the way, because this goes back to what you asked. So obviously I've now answered how to engage with it directly in my rebuttal. But part of the idea is there's a lot of stuff I didn't bother engaging with in my rebuttal, and I want to still make sure the judges know why my case is better. So this is where we move to my case, my arguments. 3 important things in terms of engagement for my case. First and most important one, the framing. Framing is crucial in debates. Everyone knows what framing is? Cool. Framing is that bit at the beginning of the speech where I tell people what it is that I'm going to talk about. But I don't just do that. I also explain why I chose this specific argument, why it is that I'm talking about this and this. And I explain this in comparison to the other teams in the room. So usually my framing, for example, if I have a member speech for government, I'm going to get up and I'm saying, we think our opening has done a wonderful job in doing this and this. The opposition have attacked this principle and this principle, which is why in my extension, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And I explain already in my intro how my arguments interact with the other side's arguments and why it is that they're important. So that's the first crucial thing. The second crucial thing to remember is that I always try, before I get up, before I make the speech, to determine a very, very simple question. Where do my argument contradict the other side's? Usually we say there are 2 likely ways of arguments engaging, right? There is one which is the probability test, so I'm saying this will happen, they're saying this will happen. Why is my case more probable than their case? If this is where our arguments engage, then that means that this is the bit I need to substantiate the most. That means this is where I'm going to dedicate most of my analysis. That means this is where I'm going to look at the most examples. That means this is where I'm going to try and think of as many analogies. I'm going to try and make my case seem like the only possible, likely, whatever outcome that defeats their case. If I believe that where the arguments interact is in the impact, so we both agree something will happen, we're just not sure whether it's good or bad, or we think this will happen, but also this will happen, and it's a question of which is more important, that then means that what I need to do is show why my impact is the most accurate and the most important in the debate. And that then means that I'm going to dedicate most of my time, most of my analysis, most of my examples, most of everything to that part of the speech. So before I get up, I always ask myself, for each and every one of my arguments, where is it heads on point with the other side? Is it a question of probability, or is it a question of impact? And according to the answer is where I choose to put the most emphasis in my argument, okay? The last thing that I'm going to say with regards to this context has to do with that last bit that I said about the impact, right? In many debates, and this is crucial to understand, the deciding point of which analysis wins has to do not necessarily with the analysis itself, but with what we often call the meta-analysis, the why should I care point. I'm going to give an example. I'm going to give 2 examples to illustrate this, right? So we've had, like, not in the last year, but in the 3 years before that, a surge of motions about punishments, right? So there was this house would only lock up violent assailants. And there was assuming that technology exists, this house would lock up people before they commit crimes. And there was assuming that technology exists, this house would burn moral values into the minds of people so that they wouldn't grow up to be criminals. And there was the 3 strikes and you're out. There were like a ton of punishment motions, right? And notice that in those motions, usually what happens is we all know, obviously, the 4 purposes of punishment. So we've got the deterrence, and we've got the retribution, and we've got the getting them out of society, and we've got the rehabilitation. And usually what happens is that some of those goes to the GOV side, and some of those goes to the OP side. And each of the sides does a wonderful job explaining why rehabilitation falls on their side or why deterrence falls on their side. And nobody gets the fuck up and says, look, here is why in this debate, the only thing that matters is rehabilitation. This is the meta-analysis. This is not necessarily why rehabilitation works on our side. It's just to say, look, this is why this is the crucial point in this debate. And many, many debates fall on that point. Second example, right? Also possibly important in this tournament since Amanda is on the edge, right? So we had in the wonderful Euros prep tournament that we had in Israel, a motion about standardized testing and about how the education system shouldn't use standardized testing. This is important because we know some members of the education teams of both Euros and here like motions about the education system. Just a tip off. But yeah. Now notice that when we talk about the education system, quite often what we have is education system has a number of purposes. One of the purposes of the education system is to prepare people for the world and to be lovely, loyal, contributing citizens, right? Another important goal of the education system is to socialize people, right? To teach them how to behave and how to act in the normal society. Another purpose of the education system is to help people maximize and fulfill themselves and self-actualize and all those lovely, lovely native speakers' words that they like to use, right? Thing is, again, in this debate, usually what happens is self-actualization goes to one side, socializing and contributing citizens goes to the other side. And where the debate actually falls down to is which of the two is more important. So bear in mind that a lot of times when we talk about engagement in our arguments, it's a lot of times about being able to explain just why what you say is more important than what the other side has said. So that's what I had to say about basically engaging within our arguments. Are there any questions about this? Yeah.
Number 4 here is competitive.
Yeah, and that's part of the idea. And if I then, after I've done that, move on to my case and show why the comparative falls on my side, I usually tend to win the debate. Yeah?
Like you had techniques for rebuttal, do you have specific techniques of how to compare cases and show why X is more important than Y?
So I think what's most important, this is actually an excellent question. I think what's most important is the idea of being debate specific. So for example, if we had the debate about repeated sex offenders, if I can say, look, we're talking about people who are, to an extent, sick, who are criminals because of the way their mind is. Rehabilitation is not relevant in this case. And then make the explanation for why. It is a lot easier for me to do that. Most of the time what happens is, quite honestly, like I said, everything is true, right? It is true that the education system tries to do this, but it is also, when you make your analysis about why in this specific case, so elementary schools, here's why this is what we care most about, and then go from there. And the more specific you are to the debate, the more likely you are to surprise the other side. Which is why I always tell people, when you get the motion, stop for 1 second and think about the specific highlights of the words in that motion, and think about that. And the other thing is, like I said, I think once you make it clear to you, where is it that I disagree with the other side? Is it about probability or is it about impact? And you focus yourself on that point, it is a lot easier to then make that substantiation in your case. Any other questions? Awesome, so we've got 5 minutes to talk about POIs. 3 main types of POIs. First, and irrelevant in this room because you're all amazing speakers, is the clarification / PT POIs. which is when I either PT the speaker and therefore I give him a POI to help them, or I PT the judge and therefore I make a clarification so that the debate doesn't die and everyone will be miserable. These are lovely POIs. This is the, you said your for chemical castration, we assume you meant consented one, whereby the criminals agree to go through the process and not that we force everyone to do it, right? Sort of POI that you give. It's not something you do in order to attack the other side, it's something you do in order to make sure we have a better debate. Sometimes, especially in the beginning of the year, we have a lot of those. As the year progresses and people become better at debating, we don't meet them a lot, and then we come to the beginning of Euros and we see them all the time. You all know what I'm talking about. Secondly is the what we call negative POIs, right? Negative POIs are when you attack the other side's argument. Now, people who I coach know that I don't generally recommend using negative POIs. The reason why I don't recommend them is because at the end of the day, I have 10 to 15 seconds, the speaker has 7 minutes. It is very unlikely that I will be able to demolish a point within those 10-15 seconds in a way that he won't be able to then recover. Which is why using a POI or wasting a POI for rebuttal is just weak. There are 3 exceptions to this rule. The first one is obviously when I think I actually can knock down an argument in 3 sentences. This sometimes happens, it's a lot of fun when you do, it's very rare. The second one is when I can point to a contradiction in either the speaker's own speech or between this speaker and other speakers of his side. Contradiction are a very useful tool in a POI because every debater, and there are some very good debaters in this room, knows that the minute you hear the person after the POI telling you, you've just contradicted your partner, you said X and he said Y, even if it's not true, every speaker immediately panics about, have I done that? How do I settle this? How do I settle it? And then they waste a good minute of their speech on trying to show why this wasn't a contradiction, right? Which is useful for us because that is then a minute they don't spend on analyzing stuff, contributing to their case, whatever. So contradictions are a useful thing to point out in a POI. Last but not least, reason to use a negative POI is if I'm a front half team, I won't get a chance to rebut this team, and I think this is the team that I'm fighting with, so I want to win the debate, right? Right now I'm OG, and it is between my reading of the debate, it is between me and CO on who wins the debate. It's useful to ask a negative POI that will lower their rankings and up mine. If, for example, bear in mind, I think that the biggest threat in the debate, for example, is CG, so my back half team, I want to ask a positive POI, something that will advance my case, something that will show why my case is more important, because I think this is the valid comparison. So if I think that the valid comparison in the judge's mind is between me and the team that I'm asking the POI, then it makes sense to use a negative POI. In all other cases, I think positive POIs are best. What are positive POIs? Those are POIs that are used to support my case. They can either be like the most benign, boring type is the, you still haven't engaged with our argument from the Prime Minister's speech about blah, 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 right? So you remind the judges of what was your point that haven't been engaged. Then the judges will never ever be able to say they didn't get a chance to engage with or they weren't reminded of or whatever. Secondly, and my personal favorite, of course, is the let's get concessions from the other side. Let's get them to agree to something and then show in our debate why this is works on our side. So for example, most famous example of this, not mine, I have to give credit to Gavin Ilsley, in the organ selling debate, right? In the organ selling debate, obviously, most obvious guideline is to say my body is my property, I have the right to, support myself using it, I have the right to use it to promote myself, blah, 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 blah. It's just like any other property, basically. And then you get a point of information and you go like, well, if the body is really like any other property, if I owe money to the bank, can the bank force me to sell a kidney in order to pay my debt? Now notice, if they say yes, they're in a bit of a problematic place right now in the debate because they've just said that banks can force people to sell up organs in order to pay debts. If they said no, They just backed out of their principle and said the body is not like any other property because the bank can't force me to sell my car, the bank can't force me to sell my TV, the bank can't force me to sell my apartment. Right? For fuck's sake, they can even take down my whole bank account, as it turns out. So it's useful to ask those kind of POIs because that then reestablishes the principles of the debate in a way that I can then use to support my case. We often say that when you make an argument, you always want to start your argument from like a shared basic assumption that both you and the other side agree on, and then proceed in like teeny tiny steps until you get to the conclusion, which is only for your side, and that's how you win the debate. If you can get the basic assumption from the other side, you can get like better and better assumptions from the other side, that helps your work. A very Israeli example, but a very clear one, is in Israel we often have the debate about should girls serve in combat roles in the army, right? Now, if I get up on a point of information and I ask the other side, do you agree that the main and most important role of the army is to defend the country? And they say yes, because it seems reasonable to say yes to that. I then can start my point by saying, look, all I have to prove to you now is that if women serve in combat roles, that undermines the army's ability to protect the country. And according to their own metric, we've won the debate, right? If they didn't concede to that, then I'd have to explain that. In Israel specifically, for example, the army also carries a very important social role, right? We have teacher soldiers, we have paramedic soldiers, we have all these kinds of soldiers that don't necessarily do combat roles. So one can argue, you know what, even if it slightly undermines the army's ability to defend the state, it supports the army in many of its other roles. So getting the concession on this debate is all about this metric is crucial. So a lot of time, my best use of positive POIs is in getting the other side to agree to specific metrics of the debate. And then once you get the concession on what's the metric of the debate, it's a lot easier to focus your case on this specific metric and pretty much prove it and win the debate. Any questions on POIs? Amazing. Then we have 10 minutes break, and at 3:30 we're going to start the next round of workshops.